Hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to Cloud Summit 2021. It's a pleasure for me to be here today presenting in this great conference. Thank you so much to the organizing team and the sponsors to make this kind of event possible for all the community. Today, we will have a quick introduction to Azure SQL. We will see all the different flavors that we can have in Azure of the database engine that we all use and love. A little bit about myself. My name is Javier Vilegas. I am from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I work as an IT director in DBA and BI services at MSC. I've been working with SQL Server for over 20 years. I am Microsoft MVP in the data platform category since 2016. I am Microsoft certified trainer, and I'm also member of the board of advisor of the Azure Data Tech community. I also define myself as a technical speaker in where I go to all the events that I'm invited to talk about SQL and Azure SQL. On the left side of the screen, you have all my contact information, email address, LinkedIn, Twitter, and my blog. Feel free to reach me if you have any questions in regard to this presentation, or if you just only want to connect. So let's start. This is how I would like to picture Azure SQL, right? This is this new umbrella that Microsoft put just to group all the SQL offering in Azure. We will see three main components plus one which was added recently. The first one is Azure Virtual Machines. This is basically what Microsoft called infrastructure as a service. Is a virtual machine pre-configured in where we can run SQL Server. The same SQL Server version that we've been using forever, right? This is quite interesting because from the Azure portal, you can go there and select from the gallery um, any combination between operating system, SQL Server version, and edition. You know that since SQL Server 2017, we can run SQL Server in Linux, right? So we can also choose whether we use Windows or Linux, whether we use SQL Server 2014, 17, 16, 19, Standard Edition, Enterprise Edition, the one we need. What it is really interesting is that if we choose one of these predefined images from the galleries, we have certain best practices regarding to SQL Server already pre-configured. Like, for example, how you distribute the data file, the log files, the location of the 10DB, several things. Uh, it's important to mention that this offering infrastructure as a service is something that is quite similar to what we've been doing today on premise, right? We have to handle the infrastructure behind SQL Server. So we also have to administer the operating system and the VM. With that, if you need to apply a patch to your Windows Server, to your Linux, this is something that you have to take care of. If you have to apply a patch to SQL Server, right, it's also something that you have to take care of. If you need to set up, for example, uh, authentication, Windows authentication, or um, Azure, Azure logins, right? You also have to set up your own virtual machine, run Active Directory, etc., etc., etc. If you need to set up high availability and disaster recovery, you have to create the window cluster with an additional virtual machine, configure the clustering, configure the availability group, do the whole thing, etc. So this is something that we've been doing today. Also, if we need to take care of doing the backups, right? This is something that we need to take care ourselves. Nowadays, Microsoft is also trying to help us with all these uh, tasks that we need to do in order to maintain the environment, like the backups and high availability. Maybe doing some of this point easier from the Azure portal, right? But again, this is something that we have to control. We have to take ownership, right? And the beauty of this option is that since it is the same SQL Server version that we have and we've been working on, right? A migration from our on-premise environment to an Azure virtual machine is extremely easy, right? Because it is the same SQL Server version. Then we have the other option, which is actually two options which are under the category of platform as a service. What is platform as a service? Well, Microsoft provides us with a SQL Server endpoint in where we just connect to that endpoint and we don't have to worry about the infrastructure behind the scene. We don't need to worry about the host, if it is Windows, if there is a missing patch, nothing, right? This is platform as a service. So we connect to the SQL Server. And all those things that I mentioned before, like, for example, backups, patching, high availability, disaster recovery, those those tasks are covered by the service itself, right? We don't have to worry about doing those kind of things because it's part of the service. It's really, really a good option, right? And let's describe the two offerings within the platform as a service offering. First one is managed instance. Managed instance is something that we can define as almost 100% compatible with SQL Server, right? But again, as a service, right? When I said almost 100% compatible, we can say that all the features that we've been using from SQL Server, like, for example, replication, CDC, service broker, all the T-SQL that we know, of course, uh, triggers, store procedures, SQL Server mail, everything that we know is there. There are only a couple of things that are not fully implemented, but beside that is, again, a great solution for hosting our SQL Server application, our SQL Server databases, right? Without without any big re-engineering or of the application itself, right? So this is managed instance, focused to be a replacement of our SQL Server virtual machine or our SQL servers on-prem, right? With the benefit that we said before regarding to platform as a service. This is a relatively new service in Azure. Then we have another service which is actually not that new, is Azure SQL Database. And in fact, it was one of the first services that were available in Azure when it was presented many years ago, right? Uh, Again, under the concept of platform as a service, without us taking care of patching, high availability, etc., right? we have this offering, which is a little bit different than managed instance. And what is the main difference, and why we have two different flavors here? Well, Azure SQL Database, one of the main characteristics is that everything had to live within the same user database. What do I mean with that? If you have an application which requires the database, and the database has a procedure which is joining tables from different user databases, you cannot use Azure SQL Database as it is, right? Because again, everything, all the objects from my application have to live within the same user database. So if this procedure, which is joining tables from my user database, but it's also joining tables that are in a different user database, well, we cannot do it as it is, right? For that, we have the possibility of having managed instance, which is more, I mean, much more similar than SQL Server, right? Um, so is this a limitation? Definitely not. I mean, just having everything on a user database is not a limitation, it's an important characteristic and something that we have to uh, consider here is that Azure SQL Database is more targeted to modern application, right? So let's say if we want to come up with some sort of rule to see which one we use, how, when, etc., I will say that the easiest way to do the first step migration is let's say we have this application running on premise for many years and we want to go to Azure, right? The easiest way to do it is, okay, we come up with a virtual machine with the same SQL Server version that we are using, or maybe the latest one, and we also migrate the SQL Server version. This is going to be the simplest one, right? But right after having the application up and running in this virtual machine, we should start uh, uh, testing and checking the possibility of using this existing application using managed instance, right? The migration from SQL Server to managed instance is as easy as taking a backup and restore it to the managed instance. It's really, really easy. But if, let's say, we have a request to start working on a new project, right? A new development that will require a database engine as a backend, definitely we need to take a look to Azure SQL Database, right? Again, if we start writing from scratch, most probably Azure SQL Database is the right choice. If we need to migrate something that exists, well, most probably, I mean, virtual machine is the first choice, and then the final home for our application will be managed instance. Mm. So here we have some points of each of the offerings, right? Something to review maybe later. But what I would like to focus on is on this difference between infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, and which are the benefit of all this offering in Azure. First of all, um, we have this concept of business continuity, right? We do have multiple options that allow us to have a highly available environment in Azure, right? In any of the options that we mentioned before. Um, in terms of backups and backups retention, and also backup, let's say, storage, or where do we store those backups that we do, right? Uh, Azure gives us the possibility of handling the backups automatically, having a retention of several years actually, and with the addition of having a copy of those backups in multiple Azure regions. Right? Those are things that are really, really important, because if we're trying to certify any of the ISO certification, well, this is one of the important points that is required, right? Uh, how we do the backup, how we retain the backup, and how do we store those backups. Then something really, really important from Azure, and something that, with Azure SQL we can take a lot of advantage, is the scalability, right? We can really easily scale up or scale down any of the three offerings that I mentioned before: virtual machine, managed instance, or Azure SQL Database. If we have today this environment running on premise and we need to, let's say, add more memory, or improve the disk performance, or maybe add more processor, well, it's a complex process in where you have to buy the hardware and physically put it within the server. That could take some time, right? Weeks or months. Well, within Azure, if you need to assign more resources, CPU, memory, disk, to any of the Azure SQL offerings, right, it's a matter of few clicks, right? So easily you can scale up or you can scale down. You have all the security that is part of SQL Server, plus the benefit of the security that we have within Azure. Something really important to mention here is that Microsoft is focusing on Azure SQL with the slogan of "it is just SQL." So all the knowledge that we have on how to write Transact SQL, right? We can use it, we can keep using it with absolutely no problem. So definitely something that I would like to emphasize. Another important thing is this concept of versionless. For managed instance or Azure SQL Database, right? There is no version. There is no 2016, 19, 2016. There's no edition enterprise standard, right? It's Azure SQL, period, right? With that, we have this continuity of the Azure SQL environment, so we can also rely on it and work in the future. Something that, today, if we need to do a migration from one version to the other, it's a complex process that we need to work with, and really do a lot of testing and make sure that everything works completely fine. Well, with that, with no version, right, this process is a little bit more easier. I'm not saying that we don't need to, you know, do anything, but definitely it's easier than what it used to be. Being versionless means that this is static. There is no improvement. There is no new features. Absolutely no. Microsoft put a lot of emphasis on new features in Azure SQL first, right? So we can see new features in Azure SQL Database or in managed instance way faster than what we can see it in the on-premise SQL Server version, right? And then we have the monitoring and the intelligent framework that we can have within Azure. So what we can say is that now with this offering, we don't need to deal with hardware contracts. We don't need to worry much about the backups because it's, all these things are built in as part of the platform as a service, offering high availability, disaster recovery, monitoring, and upgrade. These things are part of the service. If we have an existing application, an existing set of databases that we need to migrate to Azure, Microsoft give us Database Migration Assistant and Azure Database Migration Service, which are, a tool and a service that help us to do different type of migration, online migration or offline migration. So virtual machine, if we focus on these virtual machines, well, these are the points that we really need to consider. Do the right selection through the marketplace, and then, if we need to monitor and take care of these virtual machines, this is something that we've been doing forever, taking care of the storage, the CPU, the memory. Those are the things that we need to monitor and take care of, right? So within Azure, within the portal and this framework, definitely is easier. It's really easier and something to really consider. And then, manage instance, as we said, this service that allow us to move our databases simpler, sorry, as well as Azure SQL Database. So here we have one or the other, and we should set the rule before, right? For migration, managed instance, for new projects or new deployment, Azure SQL databases. So now, we took the decision, we go to Azure SQL, we go to a platform as a service offering. If we consider managed instance, we have two options, right? Which are called tiers: general purpose and business critical. General purpose is, according to Microsoft, is a good fit for most of the business workloads. And if we need additional, lower latency and additional read-only replicas, well, we can also choose business critical. This is based on the BCore model, so we have to choose the amount of virtual cores that we have in each of the offering. Azure SQL Database, initially there was a model called DTU, based on DTU, Database Transaction Unit. This is still there, but now Microsoft is also recommending the BCore model. And again, we have the general purpose tiers, business critical tier, and there is an additional tier called hyperscale, which is a great fit for big database deployment, right? If we are talking about hundreds of terabytes, definitely hyperscale is the tier that we need to consider. How do we connect to Azure SQL? Well, first of all, to do the creation of the services using the Azure portal. Then, when it is already created, how do we work with? Well, with the tools that we've been using since forever. Management Studio, the new Azure Data Studio, and then, we can use different connectivity options like PowerShell, the CLI for Azure, SQL CMD, and T-SQL, of course, right? So, as a summary, right? Azure SQL is the evolution of the best SQL Server engine in the world, SQL Server. Azure SQL includes virtual machine, managed instance, and databases. And if you remember at the beginning, I also mentioned a fourth component, which is Azure SQL Edge, which is SQL Server or Azure SQL running in ARM devices, like for example, a Raspberry Pi, right? This is a good fit for certain scenarios related to Edge. SQL Server on virtual machine is the best fit for 100% lift and shift. So I have this in premise. I have the same in this virtual machine. Azure SQL Managed Instance is the great power of the database engine with the benefit of platform as a service. An Azure SQL database based for modern cloud application, right? Let's see quickly this in action. So I have here my management studio, and I am connected to my three offerings here: my virtual machine, an Azure SQL database, and a managed instance. So I have, you know, the same user experience that we can have with SQL Server, but with the other offerings. If we go to the portal, right? We go to the main portal, we go to Azure SQL, and these are my existing resources. So if I want to create uh, any new Azure SQL component, I have databases, right? Managed instance or virtual machines. See that, for virtual machines, we have, as I said at the beginning, different combination of uh, platform, Windows or Linux, and different SQL Server versions and edition. For example, we have Windows Server running on SQL Server running on Windows Server 2019. Then here we can also see 2017 running on other SQL Server in other Windows versions, right? We have here 2019 running in Red Hat, Ubuntu, or SUSE, right? So definitely we have a bunch of options here. And as I said, if we need to connect, we have Management Studio, we have Azure Data Studio to work and connect to any of these offering. Again, absolutely no problem. All right, so this was a brief introduction to Azure SQL, right? Another good benefit is that with Azure SQL, you can integrate it with many other Azure services like Data Factory, Cognitive Services, Azure Databricks. All the Azure services are really well connected with Azure SQL. So if your project not only required a relational database, but also required any other component related to NoSQL, big data, machine learning, you can easily integrate it in this scenario. Okay, very good. I have a final slide here just to, if you want to learn more about Azure SQL, I leave you this QR code to go directly to the Microsoft documentation. Everything is well detailed, and the documentation is really great. And with that, we finish this presentation. Again, I have my contact here, so LinkedIn, Twitter, email. Don't doubt to contact me if you have any question regarding to the presentation. And with that, thank you so much. Have a great conference, and we stay in touch. Bye.